Picture a gazelle being torn apart by a pack of lions, a baby elephant slowly starving to death during a drought, or a bird struggling to escape the suffocating ash of a volcanic eruption. These are just a few examples of the countless ways innocent animals suffer. Day after day, this relentless onslaught unfolds on an immense scale, with billions of creatures over hundreds of millions of years enduring pain, fear, and distress throughout their lives. With all of this pain and suffering in the world, one has to wonder why it happens. What's the reason behind this perpetual nightmare? Well, we're assured that there exists a God who is all good and all powerful. And so we must ask, if this God exists, why does he allow such immense suffering among innocent creatures? In contrast to typical theism, animal suffering does not pose a significant challenge to typical atheism. Simply put, in the absence of a belief in a benevolent and omnipotent creator, there is no expectation that the world should be free from suffering or that pain must serve a higher purpose. Atheists, and especially naturalists, can hence acknowledge the reality of animal suffering. They can view it as an unfortunate consequence of the amoral process of nature and focus on finding practical ways to reduce and alleviate it. But the same isn't true for the vast majority of theists, and what follows is a few reasons why. We begin by looking at the moral status of non-human animals. Unlike humans, who, according to theists, are considered morally culpable for their actions, non-human animals are generally regarded as innocent creatures, incapable of making moral choices. They are driven by instinct and biological imperatives, rather than conscious decision-making. This innocence renders the suffering of animals particularly difficult to justify within a theistic framework. If God is all good and all-powerful, why would he allow countless creatures, who have done nothing to deserve their fate, to endure such immense pain and distress? Another aspect that sets animal suffering apart is the apparent lack of any higher purpose or meaning behind it. Human suffering, while still deeply problematic, is often expressed in terms of spiritual growth, character development, or the consequences of free will. Non-human animals, however, are not moral agents and do not have the capacity for spiritual growth in the same way that humans do. The misery of a koala bear severely burned in a wildfire and left to die seems to serve no greater good. It is simply a brutal, meaningless reality of the natural world. The sheer scale and intensity of animal suffering also sets it apart from human suffering. While human anguish is undeniably profound, it pales in comparison to the countless billions of animals that have suffered and died over the course of Earth's history. From the tiniest insects to the largest mammals, the natural world is rife with pain, fear, and struggle. Predation, starvation, disease, and natural disasters are just some of the ways that animals suffer, and this suffering has been going on for hundreds of millions of years, long before humans ever existed. These unique aspects of animal suffering, the innocence of the sufferers, the lack of a higher purpose, and the immense scale, pose a significant theological challenge. They call into question the traditional attributes of God. If God is all good, why would he create a world filled with so much suffering? If he is all-knowing, surely he could have foreseen the immensity of animal anguish. And if he is all-powerful, couldn't he have created a world where animals don't have to suffer so intensely? These are the difficult questions that the problem of animal suffering raises for theistic belief. Unlike the problem of human suffering, which has been grappled with for millennia, the issue of animal suffering has often been neglected or brushed aside. But in light of our growing understanding of animal sentience and the scale of their anguish, it is a problem that demands serious theological and moral consideration. As we move forward in our exploration of this problem, we'll consider some of the main theological responses to animal suffering and assess their strengths and weaknesses. The problem of evil often revolves around the question of moral evil. that is, the pain and suffering that people inflict on one another. This type of suffering, such as acts of violence, oppression, and cruelty, however difficult to comprehend, is explained by theists as the consequence of the free will that God grants humanity. Proponents maintain that, sadly, some people use this freedom to choose actions that cause harm. This is known as the free will defense, famously articulated by philosophers like Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne. They argue that free will is necessary for genuine love and goodness, and that God allows evil as a consequence of this greater good. But here lies a problem. According to traditional theists, animals, unlike humans, lack the complex moral reasoning to truly operate within the bounds of good and evil. Driven by instincts and the biological imperative to survive, their actions aren't the result of conscious malice or deliberate cruelty. A gazelle fleeing from a cheetah isn't making an immoral choice, it's simply following nature's programming. Likewise, the cheetah chasing the gazelle is not making an immoral choice either. It is also following natural instincts to survive. Both the gazelle and the cheetah are acting in accordance with their nature, and neither is morally culpable for their actions. Given the absence of moral agency in animals, it's clear that the free will defense cannot be applied to explain their suffering. Non-human animals existed long before humans, and, according to theists, non-human animals do not have the capacity to make moral choices that could justify the pain they endure. They are not choosing to inflict harm on others or engage in actions that can lead to their own suffering. Now, some theists might argue that animal suffering is indeed a consequence of human free will, despite the fact that animals existed and suffered long before humans. They might argue that God, in his omniscience, knew that humans would misuse their free will, and thus he allowed animal suffering as a sort of preemptive consequence. However, this argument faces a serious temporal problem. It seems deeply problematic to suggest that animals suffered for millions of years because of the future actions of humans. This would imply that God punished countless creatures for sins that they didn't commit, that hadn't been committed, until millions of years later. It stretches the concept of justice to an absurd degree. Moreover, this argument still doesn't explain why God would create a world in which animal suffering was a necessary consequence of human free will. An omnipotent God, it would seem, could have created a world in which humans have free will, but animals are spared from suffering. As we will see in coming chapters, this temporal problem, the fact that animal suffering predates human existence, is a perpetual thorn in the side of not just the free will defense, but to several other theodicies that attempt to explain animal suffering in terms of human actions and human spiritual development. It's a recurring theme that underlies the unique difficulty in reconciling animal anguish with belief in a loving creator. The divine hiddenness theodicy offers a distinct approach to the problem of animal suffering. It suggests that God deliberately obscures his presence, allowing his creation to operate with a degree of autonomy. This distance is purportedly necessary for authentic relationships and genuine love to develop between the creator and his creation. Within this framework, animal suffering becomes the consequence of the natural order rather than direct divine intervention. By permitting the world to function according to its own laws, even those that cause pain, God respects the integrity of his creation. While intriguing, the divine hiddenness theodicy faces several compelling critiques when it comes to animal suffering, and here are just a few. First, the value of epistemic distance rests on the idea that creatures can freely choose or reject their relationship with God. Yet animals lack the free will and moral capacity for such a conscious choice. Hence, it's unclear how God's hiddenness facilitates authentic relationships with beings oblivious to his existence. Second, the divine hiddenness theodicy elevates abstract ideals like free will and autonomy over the concrete reality of abject anguish. If a truly benevolent God exists, surely his priority would lie in minimizing the suffering of his creatures rather than upholding philosophical principles. Third, even if the concept of hiddenness is accepted, this theodicy, like every other defense, seriously struggles to account for the vast scale and intensity of animal suffering throughout history. Prolonged agony, as seen in a gorilla watching its family succumb to disease, or a bear dying slowly of starvation, seems wholly disproportionate to any goal of preserving natural order or autonomy. Such immense and prolonged suffering seems not simply excessive, but utterly pointless within the grand narrative of a benevolent creator. Further, what sort of being that can interfere could watch such inconceivable amount of horror and not wish to act? To give just one of a billion examples, are we to believe that, 2 million years ago, God looked down to see a baby elephant slowly starving to death next to the dead body of its mother, who was killed by a disease that God created? The infant cries out in distress, growing weaker each day, its suffering drawn out over weeks. All the while, God watches, unmoved, assured that this cruel fate is somehow necessary for the greater good, which pivots on the emergence of another mammal millions of years later. What kind of twisted moral framework would allow for a loving being to remain passive in the face of such immense misery? Are non-human animals mere means to our ends? The idea of a benevolent God coldly observing and accepting this suffering as part of some grand plan utterly defies our basic intuitions of compassion and morality. Hence, the divine hiddenness theodicy, like other attempts to reconcile animal suffering with a benevolent, omnipotent God, faces a formidable challenge. The lack of moral agency in animals, the prioritization of abstract principles over tangible suffering, and the sheer volume of gratuitous pain cast serious doubt on its validity as a solution. Faced with the limitations of the free will defense in explaining animal suffering and failing to find refuge in divine hiddenness, some theists have turned to the greater good theodicy. This defense posits that the suffering of animals, while undeniably tragic, ultimately serves a higher purpose in God's grand design. Proponents argue that God allows evil and suffering because they are necessary for the actualization of a greater good or for the prevention of some worse evil. Now, it's important to note that the other theodicies are typically understood to be variations of the greater good argument. The free will defense, for example, argues that the evil caused by human free will is justified because free will itself is a greater good. Similarly, the soul-making theodicy suggests that suffering is necessary for the development of virtues and character. All of these arguments propose, at bedrock, that the world we live in, with all of its evils and sufferings, is somehow the best of all possible worlds, that any other world that God could have created would have been worse overall. In the context of animal suffering, then, the greater good theodicy argues that animal pain and distress are necessary for the proper functioning of ecosystems, the survival of species, and the overall balance of nature. Predation, disease, and other sources of animal suffering are seen as playing vital roles in regulating populations, promoting adaptation, and maintaining biodiversity. As said in the last chapter, some also argue that animal suffering provides opportunities for human growth and moral development, as encountering the realities of suffering in nature prompts us to reflect on our own existence and cultivate compassion. However, the greater good theodicy struggles to clear several bars. While it provides a possible explanation, mere possibility does not entail respectful probability. Consider the philosophical notion of last Thursdayism, the idea that the universe was created last Thursday with all of our memories and evidence of a longer history being created at the same time. While this is logically possible, it's not taken seriously because it's wildly improbable and it goes against the available evidence. Similarly, while the possibility that all animal suffering is necessary for some greater cosmic good, the evidence of nature's ruthlessness and scale of gratuitous suffering overwhelmingly suggests otherwise. Believing in the greater good theodicy, in the face of such evidence, requires either ignorance of the facts or a monumental leap of faith. Moreover, this argument seems to limit God's omnipotence. If animal suffering is truly necessary for the greater good, it implies that God is incapable of creating a world where goodness can be achieved without such immense cruelty. Yet, an all-powerful God, it would seem, should be able to actualize the greater good without relying on the suffering of innocent creatures. We're told, in fact, that he achieves this approximation in heaven. So while the greater good theodicy attempts to find meaning in animal suffering, it ultimately fails to provide a convincing justification for the immense scale and intensity of animal pain. The analogy of last Thursdayism highlights the key issue. While the greater good argument is logically possible, it's highly improbable given the evidence of nature's cruelty. Accepting it requires a near miraculous leap of faith. When faced with the inadequacies of other theodicies, some theists, and especially literalists, instead opt for the doctrine of the fall. This theological concept, central to many Abrahamic traditions, asserts that the world as we know it today is not how God originally intended. The fall refers to the idea that sin and suffering entered the world as a result of human disobedience, particularly the original sin committed by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and further emphasized in the story of Noah's Ark, where God punished the world for its wickedness, sparing only Noah, his family, and the animals on the ark. According to this view, God did create a perfect world, free from suffering and death. However, when humans chose to rebel against God's commands, they brought corruption and disorder into the world. As a result, the entire creation, including the animal kingdom, was subject to consequences of sin, which included pain, suffering, and death. Proponents of this defense extend the concept of the fall to explain the existence of animal suffering. They argue that the suffering we observe in the animal kingdom is not part of God's original design, but rather the result of a fallen world. Just as human sin brought suffering into the human experience, it also introduced suffering into the animal realm. In this view, the predation, disease, and pain that animals endure are consequences of the world's deviation from God's perfect plan. The suffering of animals, then, is not something directly willed or intended by God, but rather an unfortunate result of the fall. Now, while the doctrine of the fall provides an alternative perspective on animal suffering, it faces several significant challenges. First, accepting the fall narrative requires a literal interpretation of the Bible, and with it, a rejection of an insurmountable mountain of scientific findings in fields such as geology, paleontology, and evolutionary biology. This denial of the overwhelming evidence for an ancient Earth and the gradual development of life over billions of years is a significant ask. It's such a tall order, in fact, that this defense is rarely taken seriously by scholars, despite its popularity among laypeople. Second, or at least an extension and emphasis of the first, it's extremely difficult to reconcile the idea of a fallen world with the scientific evidence of animal suffering long before human existence. The fossil record reveals that animals were subject to predation, disease, and extinction for hundreds of millions of years before humans appeared on the scene. This timeline contradicts the notion that animal suffering is the result of human sin. Third, the full explanation raises deeply worrying questions about God's omnipotence and sovereignty. If the world is not as God intended, does this imply that God's plan was thwarted by human disobedience? An all-powerful God, it would seem, should be able to maintain his perfect creation despite human sin. Fourth, attributing animal suffering to the fall does not fully absolve God of moral responsibility. Even if animal suffering is a consequence of human sin, God still chose to create a world in which such suffering was possible. An all-knowing God would have foreseen the fall and its consequences, including the immense suffering that it would unleash upon the animal kingdom. Lastly, what's with the inconsistent application of suffering across the animal kingdom? Why is it that only certain species were subject to the cruel necessity of predation? Why do some animals, like parasitic wasps, have life cycles that require them to inflict horrific suffering on their prey, such as laying their eggs inside the bodies of caterpillars, which are eaten alive from the inside by larvae? And yet other animals are spared such gruesome fate. Why were some animals, particularly those with higher cognitive capacities, burdened with the ability to empathize and grieve for the suffering of their kin? Elephants display a profound distress when their young are in peril, with reports of mothers desperately trying to rescue their calves from muddy pits, and even shedding tears of anguish. Chimpanzees, too, have been observed mourning their dead, sometimes carrying the corpses of their infants for days. This capacity for empathy and emotional pain adds a further dimension of torment that seems utterly gratuitous. If the fall was meant to punish us humans for our sin, why were these innocent creatures condemned to not only physical anguish, but psychological torment as well? The arbitrary distribution of suffering and the added cruelty of inflicted empathy and grief upon certain species seriously undermines the coherence and moral validity of the Fourth Theodicy. So, despite its popularity among theists, the Fourth Theodicy fails to provide a convincing solution to the problem of animal suffering. Its reliance on a literal interpretation of the Genesis narrative puts it at odds with the scientific evidence and the existence of animal suffering long before the emergence of human beings. Moreover, it raises perplexing questions about God's attributes. If the fall represents a deviation from God's plan, it implies that God's will can be frustrated by human actions. And if the fall is part of God's plan, this entails that God intentionally subjected animals to immense suffering as a result of human sin. Neither option provides a satisfying reconciliation of animal anguish with belief in a loving, all-powerful creator. As we've seen throughout the various theodicies we've covered, many theists acknowledge animal suffering as a serious theological problem. Some, however, have sought to sidestep the issue by straight up denying that animals are capable of experiencing genuine suffering at all. This view, which has had prominent proponents throughout history, asserts that animals are mere automata, lacking the capacity for pain, emotion, or self-awareness. One of the most famous advocates of this position was the 17th century philosopher René Descartes. Descartes argued that animals were essentially biological machines, lacking a soul or any form of inner life. Their cries and writhing, he claimed, were no more indicative of real pain than the creaking of a wagon. This view conveniently absolves humans of any moral responsibility towards animals, justifying their use and abuse for human ends. While Descartes' extreme view has fallen out of favour, echoes of his position can still be found in well-respected contemporary theological arguments. For example, the influential philosopher Richard Swinburne has expressed that animals in the pre-human world did not experience pain. This claim denies the reality of animal suffering for most of Earth's history. Such arguments, while perhaps well-intentioned attempts to resolve the problem of animal suffering, come across as ad hoc and contrary to our understanding of animal experience. They prioritize theological consistency over the clear evidence of our senses and empathy. Indeed, the scientific evidence for animal sentience is overwhelming. Numerous studies have demonstrated that a wide range of animals, including mammals, birds, and even some invertebrates, possess complex nervous systems, exhibit pain responses, and display emotional reactions. For example, elephants have been observed mourning their dead, showing signs of grief and distress. Rats have shown empathy, working to free trapped companions even when it means foregoing a food reward. Even chickens, often dismissed as unfeeling, have been found to experience complex emotions like anxiety and depression. While the subjective experience of any animal may differ from our own, the capacity for suffering is undeniable. Animals may lack the cognitive sophistication to ponder their suffering philosophically, but this does not make their pain less real or morally relevant. The reality of animal sentience has profound implications for the problem of suffering. It means that the theodicies we have considered, from the free will defense to the divine hiddenness theodicy, must grapple not only with human anguish, but with the immense scale of animal suffering throughout history. It is not enough to explain why a benevolent God would allow humans to suffer. We must also account for why he would create a world in which countless billions of sentient creatures are subjected to fear, pain, and distress, often with no apparent purpose or redemptive value. Denying animal suffering may seem like an easy way to get around the issue, but it comes at the cost of ignoring both empirical evidence and moral intuition. If we take seriously the idea of a loving God, we cannot simply dismiss the cries of his creatures as meaningless noise. Throughout this exploration, we have grappled with one of the most profound challenges to theistic belief, the problem of animal suffering. We have seen how the immense scale and apparent gratuitousness of animal anguish raises difficult questions about the existence of a benevolent, omnipotent God. Unlike human suffering, which is often explained as a consequence of free will or as a means of spiritual growth, animal suffering seems to serve no higher purpose. Animals, lacking moral agency, cannot be said to deserve their pain or to learn from it in any meaningful sense. Their anguish, which has persisted over hundreds of millions of years, appears to be a fundamental feature of the natural world. In this exploration, we have considered various attempts to reconcile animal suffering with the belief in a loving God. While each of these theodicies offers a unique perspective, they all share the same common thread. the idea that animal suffering ultimately serves some greater good. However, upon examination, these arguments crumble under the weight of the immense scale and apparent purposelessness of animal anguish. The free will defense, while potentially relevant to human moral evil, utterly fails to account for the suffering of creatures who, according to theists, lack free will. What's more, the type of free will this defense depends on, known as libertarian free will, is today only upheld by religious people. Indeed, the vast majority of philosophers reject it. Moreover, the fact that animal suffering predates human existence by millions of years renders the free will argument pretty much irrelevant to animal suffering. The divine hiddenness theodicy, which proposes that God maintains distance to allow for genuine relationships, also falls short. It fails to explain why such distance would necessitate the extreme suffering we observe in nature. If God's hiddenness is meant to facilitate authentic love and trust, it's difficult to see how the excruciating death of a mouse slowly being crushed and suffocated in the coils of a snake, or a moth being eaten alive by a praying mantis, contributes to this purpose. The greater good theodicy, while superficially compelling, relies on mere possibility rather than probability. It suggests that animal suffering serves a higher purpose, but the evidence of nature's brutality and the scale of seemingly gratuitous suffering strongly indicates otherwise. Accepting this theodicy requires a monumental leap of faith in the face of overwhelming contrary evidence. And the full explanation completely fails to account for the clear evidence of animal anguish long before human beings existed. The fossil record reveals that animals were subject to predation, disease, and mass extinction for hundreds of millions of years prior to human arrival. These facts alone severely undermine the full theodicy, requiring proponents to deny pretty much the entire enterprise of science. In the end, while these defences offer creative attempts to justify animal suffering, they all require a heavy price in terms of what we must believe. We must accept ideas that contradict scientific evidence, rely on mere logical possibilities, or stretch the concept of justice beyond recognition. And even after paying this steep price, these arguments still fail to provide a compelling account of the sheer magnitude and apparent pointlessness of animal suffering throughout history. The problem of animal suffering remains a very compelling argument against an all-powerful, all-loving God.